Hey everyone, and welcome to the very last episode of 2021. I wanted to take this time to look back at our year. I've been amazed at what the Lord has done, not only through this podcast, but in my life in general. I knew when I started this podcast that the podcast would grow and that it would evolve, and part of me knew that I would do the same. Sometimes I listened to that first episode in the very, very first season 1, episode 1, Healing That Doesn't Make Sense. And that person is absolutely unrecognizable to me. We hit some cool milestones this year. We published our 50th episode and also achieved an important milestone with episode downloads. We were able to provide double-digit pro bono counseling sessions for those who can't afford it. Later in the year, as of December of 2021, we suddenly turned into a listener/donor supported podcast. As of the recording of this podcast, we are running a fundraiser on Facebook as well as Patreon. We only have 3 months short of support for all of the production costs for 2022. That means that all donations and merchandise moving forward will fund more pro bono counseling, as well as merchandise sales will do the same. I will provide all of the ways you can help in the show notes, including the last offering of the You Are merchandise, as we will be releasing new merchandise next year. So right there in your app, click on that one of those links. That Contact Amy will take you to all of them, including the Facebook fundraiser that will end on January 31st. And you will be able to join our mission. So guys, what happened in 2021? Shall we take a short trip down memory lane? We started the year with Crissy Loughridge in an episode that we entitled Shattering Safety. Let's listen to this clip. She sat on the end where she could put her drink down to play the game. In hindsight, I remember that he slipped behind her and then beside her as he continued to chat. I was talking to the other dude and was watching her beat me in the game, but I didn't care. We were having fun. It seemed like the birthday celebration was going off without a hitch, until I looked over at her blank eyes. The guys disappeared, and I knew something was horribly wrong. That horribly wrong thing that we talked about still affects Crissy to this day. That episode highlighted the definition of PTSD. Her safety had been compromised in ways that she never saw coming. But just like all of the episodes on the Wednesdays with Watson podcast, there is hope and help for those who find that their safety has been shattered. Crissy candidly shares what that night did. It changed her forever. To listen to that episode and any of the episodes that we will mention in this episode, just scroll down in your podcast app, but her episode is Season 2, Episode 1. We moved on from there to Lindsay Tozer, who candidly shared with us her trauma, and she talked a lot, and we talked a lot, about how the body keeps the score with trauma. The Wednesdays with Watson microphone was the very first place where Lindsay felt the freedom to share her story publicly. She continued to share with me how this freedom has changed her. You can hear her story also, Season 2, Episode 2, Cause of Accidental Death and Injury, just by scrolling down. This clip from her episode is so powerful. A dark January night in 2001. That day was as you would expect it to be, in the middle of the winter in Indiana. Cold. And the Midwest native was in charge of 3 small children who sat in the backseat of her car. They were just running an errand and getting ready for something important the next day at church. But then her car hit a patch of black ice. It spun around 45 degrees, stopping only when a utility pole demonstrated the laws of physics. After that episode where Lindsay shared with us her story of accidental cause of death and injury, we began moving into even deeper stories of trauma and loss. And the third drop of the year was a fellow Children's Home alum, Anne-Marie Rivera. Let's listen to this clip from her episode. When she was at her friend's house because something was just not right. She remembers when someone finally answered the phone. She remembers the distraught person giving her the news that suddenly made an orphan. She didn't see it like her brothers did, but she remembers. My friend and little sister, trauma survivor extraordinaire Anne-Marie Rivera Alberts, who remembers that day and everyone after it and bravely wants to share her story here, because Wednesdays with Watson is the healing zone. So that is a clip from Anne-Marie's episode, who came on to talk about the story of the day that she became an orphan along with her 3 brothers, as both of her parents completed suicide. Following her episode was her brother Angel, as he shared his story. Anne-Marie, as we mentioned in the episode, was at a friend's, but Angel actually witnessed this tragedy. A few weeks later, after recording this episode, Angel sent me a text telling me that he was seeking help for all that he had ignored, and I couldn't help but think of the lyric to the song that he picked for his episode. There was something so powerful in the way that he reads this lyric.
They don't know that I go running home. They don't know who picks me up when no one is around. I drop my sword and I cry for just a little while, because deep inside this armor, the warrior is a child.
Then the very next episode we dropped, Healing from PTSD, was a special crossover event with Shea and Michelle Watson, as well as a pastor in California whose name is Marcus Watson. But this episode highlighted Shea's story of redemption and healing. His clip continues to give me chills. Shea was our first and our only guest with combat PTSD, as well as many other traumas that he experienced in his life. Listening to the strength of his voice and the power of his conviction is incredibly, incredibly inspiring. Here is the clip.
Pain through our suffering, we kind of experience a little bit of what Christ went through. Well, here's something I don't tell a lot of people. I was laying in my bed sleeping. I was given a dream of Christ being crucified, and I felt so much pain. Wow. It was almost like I was experiencing the pain that Christ had, enough to the point where I got out of bed sobbing and saying, what I've been through is nothing. And when you look at my story and you look at my history, it's not that I've been through nothing, but in comparison to the sin that Christ took on that cross, I have been through nothing. And so when I get to be told by my Father, who's done this for me, who put his son on the cross, that, you know what, I'm bringing you back to this image, the same image of me. And I want you to live in this image. I want you to live in this victory. I want you to live in this royal priesthood. You are a holy nation. To me, you're my child.
Somewhere in this process, I really began to go to the mat with God. Somehow, quote, trauma survivor seemed to be my only identity and where all of my good feelings came from. And I had to reckon with this. Do I even want to get well? Or is it easier to not be well? The warm and fuzzies that I get from all the people, is it easier to just stay stuck in my trauma? That episode was more for me. But this episode was a chance for me to remind you of the important stuff, the mission of this podcast. Let's listen into this. Prayer for you is that you would desire healing, because it is for all of us. And don't forget, Jesus wins in the end, and that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed in us. Don't forget that, guys. Don't forget that. Also, don't forget that you are seen, known, loved, heard, and valued. April is Childhood Awareness Month, and I spent that entire month seeking out childish things in an attempt to capture the magic of my childhood. And if you want to go back and look at some of those funny things, they are on my Instagram highlights. But since the mission of this podcast is to educate, the next episode featured licensed family therapist Erica Cuni. Erica helped us understand attachment styles in childhood, as well as adverse childhood experiences. She also helps us understand the importance of early intervention.
Let's listen to our attachment styles our love map. Our love maps are created by before the age of 5, more closer to 4 years old. And some are even saying it's solidified by the age of 2. But just know your primary caregiver's interactions with you from the get-go are extremely important in creating your perception of the world. It doesn't mean you're staying stuck in this if you had a insecure attachment. You can heal, you can find ways to navigate through this.
So next up, it was an honor to bring another therapist to the microphone to continue the discussion of childhood abuse, since this was still in April, Childhood Abuse Awareness Month. Jeremy Fox is a licensed EMDR therapist. Jeremy shares with us what extreme neglect does to the brains of children. Fox also discusses the misdiagnosis of ADHD that is shrouded in trauma and is often a simple PTSD diagnosis versus an ADHD diagnosis. This episode is a must-listen for parents, teachers, and anyone who works with or has children. Let's listen to this, Jeremy Fox talking about childhood neglect.
And so extreme neglect can actually make children's brains smaller. Not trying to scare people here, because there are ways through that. And as you can talk about with EMDR and changes in brain scans, there are certainly ways out of that. But lowered IQ, cognitive delays, difficulty with inhibiting behavior. Okay, I was speaking with someone on another podcast earlier about ADHD and trauma mimicking each other. So that inattentiveness and that scattered behavior is similar to both those diagnoses. But then so neglect can appear as ADHD symptoms, as you just heard, the behavioral inhibition part especially. So what we're talking about when it comes to neglect is to kind of dovetail with that attachment stuff, the lack of positive interaction from caregivers. Okay. Now, obviously, physical neglect in terms of not receiving your essential needs is 100% related to that. We're talking about that as well. There's different types.
Next, I brought to the microphone a friend of mine, Marlena, who is a suicide survivor. I want you to hear her clip first before I continue. If you have PTSD, at some point your safety has been compromised. Those words ring in my ear, they reverb in my soul, and they help me understand the life I live as a PTSD patient. She told me nobody ever asked. No one cared. They just threw a label on her because she wasn't speaking, instead of even asking or caring. They phoned in their responsibility for that day. She kept telling me, I just wanted someone to ask. I just wanted someone to give me a hug. She told me about the welts they found on her body, but that didn't stop the nightmare in her home. In my mind's eye, I remember her telling me about hiding in a closet. Those words haunt me too. So that was my friend Marlena, who I said is a childhood abuse survivor, a suicide survivor. She was one of the first people that kind of proved to me that you could still be a childhood abuse survivor with two parents. The thing that haunted me the most and what you heard in that clip is that she just wanted somebody to ask. As she told us on that episode, PTSD happens when your safety or the safety of others or someone you love has been compromised. So next I brought to the microphone my friend Rebekah Millet, who did experience and watched a near-death experience. This conversation was rich with aha moments and again highlighted the faithfulness of God. I think the question would become, would she become a widow? The phone rang and she answered. He took a deep breath and she panicked. Suddenly she was back in 2013 in the middle of the night. She recalls, I woke up and heard him struggling to breathe. Her 36-year-old, otherwise healthy husband struggled to fill his lungs with air. He described a heavy feeling in the middle of his chest. She recalled to me, I called 911 just like I saw them do in the movies. She then called family who would come watch her two young boys who were still sleeping. She told me she remembered thinking it odd that the ambulance left with only lights and no sirens. She recalls arriving at the hospital where friends and family gathered, and she received the news that her young and healthy husband was, in fact, having a heart attack, and it did not look promising. She recalls falling apart in the bathroom where she begged God to spare his life. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and so I wanted to educate you guys on some of PTSD's friends, these disorders that coexist with PTSD. I brought another therapist to the microphone to do that. Dr. Patrice got behind the microphone to help us with this understanding. We talk a lot about safety and the importance of addressing these co-occurring disorders, and she even describes some of them. Let's listen to this clip with Dr. Patrice Berry and co-occurring mental disorders.
The same way for everybody. And so that's where somebody would talk with their practitioner about how it maybe came about, because really it's how were you functioning before, and then how are you functioning now? And sometimes some of the things that people pick up, it helped them survive that event. And now that they are safe, the problem is that we're still doing a lot of those behaviors, even though we're safe now.
So I thought that was really, really interesting from Dr. Berry talking about safety, again, the linchpin of post-traumatic stress. I wanted to continue to highlight healing, and so I brought Lindsay Tozer back to the microphone. Since she shared her cause of accidental death and injury experience for the first time publicly earlier in the season, I wanted to know how she was doing now. This was months after the fact, and here is what she has to say to you guys.
Who, no matter what, is always going to be there for you. If you're not comfortable with how that feels, if it makes you feel uncomfortable, I am sorry. But you are loved and cared for and cherished, and you will always be. And that feeling is something that will always be with you for the rest of your life, no matter how hard you try and push it down.
So not only is Lindsay talking about just working through things, but she is talking about the tremendous, overwhelming love of God. After Lindsay's update, I wanted to check in with Crissy. She opened the season by telling us how having her drink drugged and escaping date rape shattered all she knew to be true. So I wanted to check on her. Could she accept the complex truth that God is both good and also allows suffering?
He's good. And what do I do with that? The quote is, can I accept a more complex truth? And the complex truth is both.
We need to give credit to that.
That is Becky Wade, Let It Be Me. And it is just really a powerful,
Give us that quote again.
The character, could he accept a more complex truth?
Wow.
That God is both good and it goes on.
Yeah, so chew on that one for a second, guys. Next up, I wanted to provide a resource for parents who are raising children with PTSD. For this, I brought Troy McLaughlin to the mic. He is a fellow podcaster. He was brutally honest and offers practical advice for those who are parenting children with trauma. He offers great wisdom and encouragement. Let's listen to what he has to say.
Remember that this may take a very long time. This may be a road. You may see glimpses of good, and then it goes back to the other way. Hang in there. Make sure that here's the other thing. I don't think we often do this. When we're walking through these things, or we're talking to others about it, everybody needs a therapist. Now it may not be quote unquote professional therapy, but it's a community belonging, and we need to bounce these things off, because oftentimes, like you said, this thing is going on in our head that may not be true.
So you notice that Troy there hits two of the C's, community and counseling. And I think if you were to listen to the whole episode, as you should, scroll down in your app and you will see Parenting PTSD by Troy McLaughlin. He will also talk about church. It had been on my heart to cover the loss of a child on the podcast, so I invited Randy Mortensen to the mic to tell us his story and how he is turning his pain of losing his child into tremendous purpose. Randy took a difficult road to healing. He tells us about his faith journey, his feeling of hopelessness. His episode highlights crazy hope, but it wasn't always that way for him. Let's listen to what he says here.
I thought I had faith, but I didn't know what I didn't know from a faith standpoint,
sure.
Basically. And we can talk about that a little bit more in depth later. But it was just the utter hopelessness of how is my life going to have meaning going forward, even. That's how dark it was.
So that was an incredibly rich episode, and I strongly encourage you to go back and listen, because we are not wired to lose our children, and what a powerful story that Randy has. Next up, by this time in the process, I had gotten plenty of shade, for lack of a better word, from some listeners on my mission here. These were name it, claim it messages. You've got a problem, I've got a Bible verse thrown at me, and not very much, but it did spur me to record a solo episode about weaponizing the gospel. I shared with listeners how that affected me over the years and how the misunderstanding of one single Bible verse and the misteaching of one single Bible verse did more harm than good. Let's take a listen. Just ruled me, and I didn't even understand that it was doing that. I have paid for this thought process in spades over the years. I kept putting my hand to that plow and not looking back, not getting help, until I couldn't anymore. And that fallout is well documented on this podcast, Season 1, Hospitals and Courtrooms. So in that same spirit, I also wanted to discuss spiritual abuse. I brought to the mic Tiffany Countryman for this episode. I picked a millennial for this episode because I wanted to highlight that stories like Tiffany's are still happening in 2021. Both weaponizing the gospel and the mistreatment of people pushes people away from the start of the story. I asked her some hard questions. Her answers were hard to hear. Listen to this. Anybody in that church come into your place, regardless of whether you feel like you were wrong or not by getting pregnant, you were hurting, you were poor, you were being maligned at this point by not only by your baby daddy, but by people who listened to him. Did a single soul sit you down and say, hey, I love you. Let us walk you through this. What can we do? Did a single soul do that?
Not one person, Amy. Not one person in that church.
Oh, even hearing that again just makes me sad. By this point in the year, I became relatively introspective. And so the next episode chronicled a time when I can pinpoint where healing occurred, and it started by raising my stone of help. This episode was a moment for me, and I wanted to share it with listeners. Listen to this clip. The Red Cross, and reminded me of the wooden cross where they killed my Jesus. He gave his life for me so that I could have victories like I was having at that moment. On my way back, I realized I never picked up my Ebenezer after I took the picture. I fully expected the ocean to have devoured it, and that would have kind of been perfect, actually. A new song shuffled on my phone. This time, another lyric forced more water from my eyes. So as I continued, I had this realization that at that moment, I was going down in flames by this point in the year. Part of that was a result of my all-out Watson style of going into something and going into it hard, as I have done with this podcast and everything that surrounds it. I got behind my microphone, any microphone actually, that would have me. Anybody that would offer a guest spot, I would be on it. I wrote about it, all of my trauma, in an attempt to finish my book. I mentored whoever DM'd me. I held clubhouse rooms that were heavy and triggering. And then I almost heard God say, enough. If I never use any of your story, would you be okay with that? And so I recorded an episode called These Are My Stories, These Are My Songs, full on with music and my entire testimony. I told my full story publicly for the last time, at least for a while. It was time for me to remember that I mattered too. I shared a little bit about how just at 19 years old, having to make a decision that I hope some of you never have to make. Take a listen. She was in a coma, and I was in shock, but something deep inside of me needed to be in that room with her. And so I stayed all night, with stories of how she failed to protect me and never chose me. I guess there was a part of me that wished that she would wake up and explain it all to me, but she didn't. She was never going to wake up, and 2 months later, we signed those papers. After publishing that episode, I realized I needed some more help. I needed some more support. Some in the Christian world have troubles with the Enneagram, and that's okay. I respect that. My goal in starting that work in this series was to understand how God made me. In doing that, I began to simply pay attention to my own trauma and in my own body. In paying attention, I realized a lot about myself. My childhood trauma and the wounding messages that I received were still ruling me. I have said over and over again that knowledge is power, and therefore I decided to spend time connecting how we are made and what drives us by ways of our motivations and our fears. Let's listen into this clip as I introduce my experience with the Enneagram. More to learn in my journey with PTSD. Today, I will share my experience with my Enneagram coach, including the jaw-dropping moment that my trauma made sense. So after that episode, as I was just mentioning, I was honored that Karissa Harrison joined me as we held an in-depth conversation about a gospel-centered approach to the Enneagram and how it can help us process trauma. Karissa helps us understand why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. What are our core motivations? What are our core fears? Let's listen into this clip.
The Enneagram is a Greek word that just stands for 9, the number 9, and drawing. And it really is, at its simplest, a personality framework that helps us understand why we think and feel and behave the way that we do. And so the Enneagram is distinguished, the 9 types are distinguished, not by how we behave, not by our personality patterns, but by our internal motivations. What are the core motivations that are actually driving the way that we think and feel and behave? And this is what sets the Enneagram apart from DISC or StrengthsFinders or Myers-Briggs. And in my opinion, it's what makes it that much more powerful, because we're not just treating the stuff on the surface, we're getting to the root of what's causing the stuff to happen.
So after my own positive experience, as I continue to experience, my understanding of how God made through the framework of the Enneagram and why and how I process trauma, I wanted to provide interviews with each Enneagram type and pair it with trauma and loss. So first up was our Enneagram Type 1 author, Becky Wade. Becky had just experienced a loss, and so we wanted to know how she processed that within the framework of how God made her. And so we asked her that question, but I love what she says here. Let's listen to part of her clip.
I think what I've learned for myself in my own life is that I am most joyful and most at peace, closest to the heart of God when I am not viewing myself based on my performance.
When she is not viewing herself based on her performance. That was so powerful, as is that interview. Next up, I decided to represent the Type 2s, the helpers. You know, most would agree that I am pretty vulnerable, but on this day, I gave my microphone to Crissy to interview me. Earlier that day, I had experienced for my first and only, way too close to home, COVID loss. You can hear it in my voice in this clip. This was by far the most vulnerable I have been on the podcast. What happens when our core fears are actually realized? I think that having realized that core fear at such a young age, being unwanted and unloved and being abandoned and harmed by those that brought me into this world, my mom, I've never, up until about 10 years ago, never knew anything different than that. It hurts a lot to know that my flesh and blood didn't want me, and then fast forward into my 20s, my husband didn't want me. Up next, I asked Katie Ganchard, author Katie Ganchard, to represent Type 3, the Achievers. Katie's episode is a rich conversation culminating in a deep-seated need and an understanding of what Type 3s need. Let's listen in.
I think it's so much for me is about wanting to bring value into a situation or a relationship, because I feel like that's how I'm seen.
So she understands that her value is just in being seen, not, again, by performances. Such a good episode. Up next, I asked a millennial who also has trauma to represent Type 4s. Rachel Odom brings so much value to the podcast, proving to us that Type 4s are always enough and never too much, especially in the presence of trauma. But this young lady brought it to the mic. Let's listen to just a clip of her episode.
When I think of it in that way, the terms defective, inadequate, emotionally cut off, and the belief that there's something inherently wrong with me, I can see how that would influence the way that I live and the way I relate to people.
That's an amazing episode. You guys are not going to want to miss that. So again, just scroll down in your app. Next up was another millennial, Sophia Walsh, who is a thyroid cancer survivor. She represented our type 5s. This episode is full of information on how Sophia processed her trauma within the framework of how God made her. And she tells us that she wishes how she understood more about how God made her at the onset of her trauma. She helps us understand how we can do life with 5s, especially when those 5s have experienced trauma. Let's listen to this clip.
I thought for so long about this. I think I'm going to use the spoon analogy too, because it's just so good. Even though this is going to sound selfish to an extent, but hear me out, okay? Even though I have all 10 of my spoons, sometimes 10 are not enough for a day for me.
So again, another good interview with our Enneagram Type 5. And so we ended the year with Sophia Walsh, and the very first drop of 2022 will be our Enneagram Type 6, and that will be Crissy Loughridge. Now we're going to step out of order here a little bit, but it is important. October is both Breast Cancer Awareness Month as well as Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so one Wednesday in October, we did a double drop. First up is Audrey Mabry, who brings fire to this episode. And she shares the story of redemption, beauty from literal ashes because of an offense that gave her husband a life sentence in prison. She tells us if you want to look at the fruit, look at the roots. Audrey's story has been covered on national platforms, and we were honored to have such hope and help as she shared on this podcast. She talks about advocating differently and how we can continue to change the narrative. But listen to this clip that we played before the interview with Audrey.
He was the type of man that constantly accused me of cheating on him. He was a controlling man. He was a jealous man. But he never hit me.
So you're going to want to go listen to that story. Trust me on that one. Following that episode, I had the honor of interviewing breast cancer survivor and one of my college buddies, Tammy Williamson. Tammy brings tears, hope, and emphasizes our mission here. She tells us the power of community and how it helped her in her journey with breast cancer trauma, and it alleviates fears. And so let's listen in to this clip from her. She told me that she thought the machine was broken. Or perhaps the technician was brand new and just kind of learning her way. It was just after her 40th birthday, and the mom of 6 probably found the day spent at the doctor as a huge inconvenience and an annoyance. Her children, ranging from ages 10 to 17, were no doubt at home, wondering where Mama was and what was for dinner. Again, an episode that you're going to want to go back and listen to, and that is true of all the ones that I've shared with you here today in our 2021 recap. Finally, though, we published our 50th episode, which happened to be also on my 50th birthday. For this episode, I asked 5 people from my 5 generations to come celebrate with me. This episode highlights everything I believe in: the power of community and the presence of trauma, the importance of church, and the necessity of counseling. Crissy ends that podcast in one of the most powerful ways I've ever heard on any podcast anywhere. And so let's listen to how she ended my happy birthday episode.
And for those out there thinking, I'm too broken, He is more. His mercy is more. His grace is more. His love is more. His healing is more. His joy is more than the greatest sorrow. His justice is more. He is more. And so, again, if you can download the song, it's kind of a fun thing to change the lyrics out. Whatever it is, our sins, they are many. His mercy is more. Our hurts, they are many. His love, it is more. Our pain, it is great. His love, it is more. He's just more. And there's never a day that goes by that I don't recognize what we've been through in the past 14, 15 years easily.
So that was Crissy's admonishment to us, and she was what she was saying at the end of that clip is over the last 14 or 15 years of some of the stuff that we've walked, easily at any point we could just say, time out, uncle, we're done. But she talks about more how his mercy is more, how his grace is more, how his comfort is more. And so I hope that you will receive that. Well, guys, here we are. December the 21st, 2021 is when I'm recording this. And I just love to wish all of my peeps a Merry Christmas and a very Happy New Year. I speak over you the promises of the star of the story, the promises of Jesus. And remember, like Crissy said, he is more. I do hope that you enjoyed this 2021 recap and maybe heard an episode that can help you or somebody you love. We will be back in 2 weeks, as I mentioned, picking up on the Enneagram 6. It has been my honor to create this content for you over the last 20 or so months. And as I always say, I will never, ever, ever stop fighting for those who can't fight for themselves. As I mentioned, this has turned into a listener/donor-supported podcast. You will find the link to the Facebook fundraiser that runs through December 31st, 2021 in the show notes, as well as that Contact Amy, which has our Patreon link. It gives you the opportunity to either a one-time gift or an ongoing gift that would help us and our goal here to continue to produce content, as well as provide pro bono counseling for those who can't afford it, and all of the things that we need to do to get the message of hope and help out to the people. So until next time, when I'm here with you in 2 weeks in the Healing Zone, it'll be 2022, y'all. You're still going to be seen and known and heard and loved and valued. Because guess what? You've never been more loved than you are right now.